Welcome back to Horror Vault Channel. In this video, I will tell you 5 scariest road trip gone bad true horror stories that have happened in the recent past with regular people like you and me. I would highly recommend you to subscribe to this channel if you are a fan of such true horror stories. Without delay, let us get started. Story 1. The Ghost Bus of Route 40. The story takes place on the dangerous and winding road between Ixtapan de La Salle and Toluca, Mexico. This highway, infamous for its sharp curves and steep cliffs, is the site of a tragic accident involving Bus 40 in the late 1980s. The road is now safer, but the legend of the ghost bus continues to haunt travelers. It was supposed to be just another investigation for my blog, a deep dive into one of Mexico's most infamous urban legends, Bus 40. My name is Miguel Torres, and I've spent years chasing stories about haunted places and supernatural events. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on Route 40. My friend Ana Delgado agreed to join me for this trip. She's always been skeptical about these things, but loves photography enough to tag along for an adventure. We arrived in Ixtapan de La Salle just before sunset and spent hours talking to locals about the legend of Bus 40. A ghostly vehicle said to appear on rainy nights near Calderon Bridge. The rain started as we drove onto Route 40 that evening, a steady drizzle that quickly turned into a torrential downpour. Visibility was poor, but I was determined to find something, anything, that could validate the legend. And then we saw it. Headlights cutting through the darkness behind us before overtaking our car. It was an old bus with faded paint and rusted metal. Its number barely visible. 40. My heart raced as it came to a stop ahead of us. "Let's go," I said, grabbing my camera. "You're insane," Anna replied, but she followed me anyway. Inside was worse than I imagined. Silent passengers with lifeless expressions stared straight ahead while an eerie chill filled the air. The driver greeted us with an unsettling smile before motioning for us to sit down. I tried taking photos but couldn't get my camera to work properly. It was as if something didn't want me documenting what I saw. When we reached Calderon Bridge, the site of Bus 40's crash, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. Flames flickered outside. Screams echoed faintly inside. Everything felt wrong. The driver stopped abruptly and told us we had reached our destination. "This is where you get off." As we walked away in pouring rain, he warned us not to look back, but curiosity got the better of me. What I saw will haunt me forever. Passengers engulfed in flames, their faces twisted in agony, their screams silent yet deafening in my mind. I don't know how Anna pulled me away or how we made it back alive, but even now, weeks later, I can't shake off that night's terror. Sometimes I wake up hearing those screams, or seeing Don Hector's grotesque face in my dreams. And then there's this photograph. An envelope left at my door containing an image of Bus 40 with me and Anna sitting among its passengers. That's the end of story number 1. Now to the next road trip true horror story. Story 2. The Man with the Syringe. It was a stormy evening in late October when Claire, a 29-year-old nurse, finished her shift at the hospital. The rain was relentless, hammering down on the roof of her old pickup truck as she drove home through the winding roads of the countryside. Her route took her through a desolate stretch of road surrounded by dense woods. The trees loomed tall, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws in the darkness. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. The rhythmic swish of the wipers and the hum of her truck's engine were the only sounds accompanying her. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 10:43 p.m. She was eager to get home, curl up with a hot cup of tea, and forget about the long day. As she rounded a sharp bend, her headlights illuminated something ahead on the road. A man stood there, drenched from head to toe, his figure barely visible through the sheets of rain. He was motionless, staring directly at her truck. Claire slowed down, unsure what to do. Her instincts screamed at her to keep driving, but her training as a nurse compelled her to stop. What if he needed help? She rolled down her window just enough to call out over the sound of the rain. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" she asked. The man didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a moment longer before taking a slow step toward her truck. As he came closer, Claire's stomach tightened with unease. His clothes were tattered and soaked, clinging to his thin frame. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. I need help," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the rain. Claire hesitated. Something about him felt off. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural. Then she noticed what he was holding. A large syringe filled with a strange yellow liquid that seemed to glow faintly even in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat. "What's that in your hand?" she asked cautiously. The man didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, a chilling grin that revealed yellowed teeth, and took another step closer. Alarm bells went off in Claire's head. She quickly rolled up her window and locked the doors. The man's expression darkened as he reached for the handle of her truck's door and yanked on it violently. "Let me in," he screamed, his voice now hoarse and desperate. Claire's hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. She was too far out in the woods. The man began pounding on her window with his free hand, while brandishing the syringe in the other. "Open the door," he bellowed. Claire's mind raced as she tried to think of what to do. She couldn't drive off. The man was standing too close to her truck, and she risked running him over. But staying put wasn't an option either. His erratic behavior made it clear that he was dangerous. Suddenly, he stopped pounding on the window and stepped back slightly. For a brief moment, Claire thought he might leave. But then he lunged forward and slammed his entire body against the driver's side door with enough force to rattle the truck. The impact jolted Claire into action. She grabbed an umbrella from the passenger seat and held it tightly like a weapon as she prepared herself for whatever came next. The man moved around to the front of her truck and pressed his face against the windshield. His eyes were wide with madness as he grinned at her again, raising the syringe high above his head like a trophy. "You'll regret this," he hissed before slamming his fist against the glass. Claire's breath came in short gasps as she realized she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act now. Summoning all her courage, she threw open the passenger side door and bolted out into the rain. She ran blindly into the woods, branches scratching at her arms and face as she stumbled through the undergrowth. Behind her, she could hear the man shouting incoherently as he gave chase. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself to run faster despite slipping on muddy ground. The rain made it nearly impossible to see or hear anything clearly, but she knew she couldn't stop. Not even for a second. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw him emerging from the trees behind her, still clutching that horrifying syringe. His movements were erratic but relentless. It was clear he wouldn't stop until he caught her. Desperate for an escape route, Claire spotted an old hunting cabin up ahead, a small structure barely visible through the rain and darkness. She sprinted toward it with every ounce of strength she had left. Reaching the cabin, Claire threw open its creaky door and slammed it shut behind her. She slid an old wooden beam across it as a makeshift lock before collapsing onto the floor in exhaustion. The interior of the cabin was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and broken furniture. Claire grabbed an old hunting knife from a dusty shelf and positioned herself near a window where she could see outside. Moments later, she spotted him again, his silhouette moving through the rain toward the cabin. He reached the door and began pounding on it furiously. "Let me in!" he screamed again, his voice echoing through the night. Claire gripped the knife tightly, ready to defend herself if necessary. But then everything went eerily quiet. The pounding stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain hitting the roof. For several tense minutes, Claire stayed perfectly still, listening for any sign of movement outside. Just when she thought he might have given up and left, a loud crash shattered one of the cabin's windows. The man climbed through it with terrifying speed despite cutting himself on shards of glass. Blood dripped from his arms as he advanced toward Claire with that same deranged grin plastered across his face. "This won't hurt much," he said mockingly as he raised the syringe once more. Claire didn't hesitate. She lunged forward with all her might and slashed at him with the hunting knife. The blade caught him across his arm, causing him to drop both the syringe and his composure as he howled in pain. Seizing her chance, Claire kicked him hard in the chest, sending him sprawling backward onto broken furniture. Without waiting to see if he would get back up again, she bolted out of another door at the back of the cabin and ran toward what looked like headlights in the distance, a rescue team responding to her earlier distress call. The police arrived just in time to apprehend Claire's attacker before he could flee into the woods again. They later informed her that he was an escaped mental patient who had been terrorizing women along that stretch of road for weeks, using stolen medical supplies from abandoned clinics nearby. Though shaken by her ordeal, Claire was grateful to be alive and vowed never again to let fear paralyze her when faced with danger on lonely roads at night. From that day forward, she carried pepper spray wherever she went and made sure never to travel alone without proper precautions ever again. That's the end of story number 2. Now we head towards the next chilling story. Story 3. The Stranger's Directions. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Adam, a long-haul truck driver, found himself navigating a detour through the remote back roads of West Virginia. A major accident had closed the main highway, forcing him to rely on his instincts and a crumpled paper map, since his phone had died earlier in the day. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield of his 18-wheeler, and the narrow, winding roads were becoming increasingly treacherous. Adam had been driving for hours without seeing another vehicle or a single sign of civilization. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. He cursed under his breath and kept an eye out for any place where he could stop for food or directions. As he rounded a bend in the road, he spotted a lone figure walking along the shoulder. The man was drenched from head to toe, his tattered raincoat barely offering any protection from the downpour. Adam hesitated for a moment, but decided to pull over. He figured the stranger might know the area and could help him get back on track. The man approached cautiously, his face obscured by the hood of his raincoat. Adam rolled down his window slightly and called out, "Hey there, you need a ride?" The man shook his head and leaned closer to the window. "No ride," he said in a gravelly voice, "but I can give you directions." Relieved, Adam nodded. "Great. I'm trying to get back to the main highway. Do you know how?" The stranger paused for a moment, as if considering something, before giving Adam detailed instructions. "Take this road about 5 miles up," he said, pointing ahead. "You'll see an old dirt path on your left. Turn there. It's quicker than doubling back." Adam frowned slightly. A dirt path didn't sound like the best option for an 18-wheeler, but he was desperate to get out of this maze of back roads. "Thanks," he said reluctantly as he rolled up the window. The man stepped back into the rain and disappeared into the mist as Adam drove off. Following the stranger's directions, Adam soon spotted the dirt path. It looked rough and overgrown, but there was enough space for his truck to squeeze through. Against his better judgment, he turned onto it. The path wound deeper into the forest, and the trees grew denser with each passing mile. The rain had turned the dirt into thick mud, making it difficult for Adam's truck to gain traction. His headlights barely pierced through the darkness ahead. After what felt like an eternity, Adam began to regret taking this route. He hadn't seen any signs of life. No houses, no cars, just endless trees and mud. He glanced at his fuel gauge nervously. It was lower than he'd realized. Just as he was considering turning around, he saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance. The light came from an old building that looked like it had been plucked straight out of another era. A faded wooden sign above the door read Granny Mae's Kitchen. The windows were fogged up from warmth inside, and Adam could make out faint silhouettes moving around. His stomach growled again, louder this time. He decided to stop and grab something to eat while asking for better directions. Adam parked his truck in the muddy lot and stepped inside. The restaurant was eerily quiet despite being dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. A few patrons sat scattered at tables, their heads bowed low over their meals. None of them looked up as Adam entered. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with gray hair tied in a bun and an apron stained with grease. She greeted him with a toothless smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome," she said in a raspy voice. "What can I get ya?" Adam ordered fried chicken and mashed potatoes, the special listed on a chalkboard menu, and took a seat near the window. As Adam waited for his food, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The other patrons never spoke or even acknowledged each other's presence. Their movements were slow and mechanical as they ate in silence. When his food arrived, Adam noticed that it smelled strange. Not bad exactly, but not quite right either. He hesitated before taking a bite, but decided hunger outweighed caution. The chicken tasted fine at first, crispy and well seasoned, but after a few bites, Adam began to feel lightheaded. His vision blurred slightly as an overwhelming sense of drowsiness washed over him. He pushed his plate away and tried to stand up, but found that his legs felt like lead weights. "What's happening?" he slurred as he turned toward the counter. The elderly woman was no longer behind it. Instead, she stood directly behind him with that same unsettling smile plastered across her face. Before Adam could react, strong hands grabbed him from behind and dragged him out of his chair. He struggled weakly but couldn't muster enough strength to break free. He was hauled into a back room where several other people stood waiting. People who looked eerily similar to those sitting in the dining area earlier, but now wore sinister grins that revealed sharp teeth glinting under dim light. "Fresh meat," one of them hissed as they circled around him like predators stalking prey. Adam's heart pounded wildly as adrenaline surged through him despite whatever drug they had given him earlier. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his body, he lashed out blindly with his fists and managed to knock one of them off balance. Seizing the opportunity, he stumbled toward what appeared to be an exit door at the far end of the room. Adam burst through the door into pouring rain once more, but didn't stop running until he reached his truck parked outside Granny Mae's kitchen. He climbed into the cab with trembling hands and fumbled with his keys until finally starting the engine. As he sped away down that muddy path without looking back once more toward that cursed restaurant glowing faintly behind him like some malevolent beacon amidst darkness, he vowed never again would trust strangers' directions or stop at roadside diners hidden deep within forests for fear they might not let him leave alive next time. And that's the end of story number 3. And here's the next spooky road trip story for you. Story 4. The Phantom of Saltillo Road. This story has happened on the highway connecting Monterrey and Saltillo in Coahuila, Mexico. This stretch of road is infamous for its steep slopes, sharp curves, and eerie atmosphere, especially at night. In this story, there is this legend of a mysterious woman in white, known as La Mujer de Saltillo, which has terrified drivers for decades on this route. Raul Morales is a seasoned truck driver making his usual late-night trip from Monterrey to Saltillo. He's used to the dangers of the road, steep descents, unpredictable weather, and exhaustion. But he's never believed in the supernatural stories told by other drivers. As Raul descends one of the highway's steep slopes, he spots a woman dressed in white, standing by the roadside, waving him down. Reluctantly, he stops and offers her a ride. The woman introduces herself as Clara Sanchez and asks to be taken to her family's ranch nearby. Clara seems distant but polite, keeping her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Raul tries to make small talk but gets little response. Something about her presence unsettles him. A chill in the air, her pale complexion, and an odd sense of familiarity. As they drive, Clara directs Raul toward a dimly lit side road leading to an isolated ranch. Along the way, she begins to open up about her life, mentioning that she hasn't been home in years due to a tragic accident that changed everything. Raul grows increasingly uneasy as he notices strange occurrences. His radio picks up static despite being turned off. Shadows flicker across the road where no trees or obstacles exist, and Clara's reflection doesn't appear in his rearview mirror. When they reach the ranch, Clara thanks Raul and steps out of the truck. She walks toward the house, but vanishes before reaching it. Confused and frightened, Raul decides to speak with the ranch's owner. An elderly man named Don Ernesto answers the door. When Raul mentions Clara, Don Ernesto's face pales. He explains that Clara was his daughter, but died years ago in a hit-and-run accident on this very road while trying to walk home. Horrified by what he's just learned, Raul leaves the ranch and drives back toward Saltillo. However, as he approaches the spot where he first picked up Clara, his truck suddenly stalls. The headlights flicker before going out entirely, leaving him in total darkness. Raul hears faint footsteps approaching and sees Clara standing in front of his truck. Her expression is no longer calm, but filled with sorrow and anger. She accuses him of being no different from other drivers who ignored her when she needed help most. The truck's cabin grows icy cold as Clara reveals her true form, a spectral figure with hollow eyes and blood-stained clothes. She tells Raul that she has been waiting for someone to help her find peace, but that no one ever listens. Desperate to escape, Raul recalls Don Ernesto's words about Clara's tragic death and realizes she is trapped between worlds because of unresolved pain. He pleads with her to let him help her move on. In a flashback-like sequence triggered by Clara's touch, Raul witnesses her final moments. Her desperate attempt to flag down passing cars after being struck by a speeding vehicle and left for dead on the roadside. Moved by her suffering, Raul promises to honor her memory by ensuring no one forgets her story. He places an offering, a small cross and flowers, by the roadside where she died and recites a prayer for her soul. Clara's ghostly form softens as she thanks him with tears in her eyes before fading into the night. The truck starts again on its own, and Raul continues his journey with a newfound respect for the legends of Saltillo Road. Raul keeps his promise by sharing Clara's story with other drivers at truck stops along his route. Over time, reports of La Muerte de Saltillo diminish as more people leave offerings at her roadside memorial. In a chilling final scene, Raul drives past the spot one last time and sees Clara standing there. Not as a ghost, but as a peaceful figure bathed in soft light. She smiles at him before disappearing forever. This is the end of story number 4. Now, we will begin the final scary road trip story. Story 5. The Silent Figure on the Highway. It was a cold winter night in late January, and Ryan, a 32-year-old software engineer, was driving through the desolate stretch of Interstate 70 in Utah. The road was infamous for its isolation. 110 miles of nothing but barren landscapes, no gas stations, no restaurants, and no cell service. Ryan had made this drive before, but never at night. This time was different. His grandfather had fallen gravely ill back in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he was rushing to see him one last time. The clock on the dashboard read 1:42 a.m. The stars above were breathtakingly clear, but the darkness around him was oppressive. His car hummed steadily as he sped along the empty highway. He had filled up his tank at Salina before entering the stretch of road, but even with his precautions, he couldn't shake the unease that crept over him. "Just keep going," Ryan muttered to himself, trying to drown out the eerie silence with his own voice. But then it happened. A loud pop followed by a sudden jolt to the left. His car began to wobble uncontrollably. "Damn it!" Ryan cursed as he gripped the steering wheel and pulled over to the side of the road. He turned on his hazard lights and stepped out into the freezing night air. The front left tire was completely flat. Ryan sighed and grabbed his flashlight and tools from the trunk. He had changed a flat tire before, but doing it here, in total darkness with no one around, felt unnerving. As he crouched down to inspect the damage, his breath formed clouds in the icy air. The only sounds were the faint rustling of wind and his own movements. He worked quickly, loosening the lug nuts and preparing to swap out the spare tire. Then he saw it, movement in his peripheral vision. Ryan froze, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as he scanned the area. About 30 feet away, just beyond the reach of his headlights, stood a figure. It was tall and unmoving, cloaked in shadow. "Hello," Ryan called out hesitantly. his voice echoing into the void. The figure didn't respond or move. It just stood there, watching him. Ryan's heart began to race as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it another traveler? A hitchhiker? But how could anyone be out here on foot? He hadn't seen another car for miles. "Do you need help?" he asked again, louder this time. Still no response. Ryan's instinct screamed at him to get back in his car and lock the doors, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned back to his task, keeping one eye on the figure as he worked as quickly as possible to replace the tire. Minutes felt like hours as he tightened the lug nuts on the spare wheel. When he glanced up again, his stomach dropped. The figure had moved closer. It was now standing just 15 feet away. Ryan's hands trembled as he finished securing the tire. The figure remained eerily still despite being so close now that Ryan could make out more details. It appeared to be a man dressed in tattered clothing that didn't seem appropriate for the freezing weather. A short-sleeved shirt and jeans. What unsettled Ryan most was that the man's head hung low, his face obscured by shadows. "Hey, are you okay?" Ryan asked again, this time with an edge of panic in his voice. Finally, the man spoke, but not in a way Ryan expected. "You need help." The voice was raspy and unnatural, as though it took great effort for him to form each word. "No, I'm fine." Ryan stammered as he backed toward his car door. "I've got it under control." The man took a step forward. "You need help." Ryan's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. He yanked open his car door and jumped inside, slamming it shut and locking it immediately. His hands fumbled for the ignition key as he kept glancing at the man through the windshield. The figure stood motionless again for a moment before tilting its head unnaturally to one side, as if studying him, then took another step closer. Ryan's engine roared to life just as the man reached out a hand toward his car hood. Without thinking twice, Ryan slammed on the gas pedal and sped off down the highway. His heart pounded as he glanced in his rearview mirror, only to see that same figure standing in the middle of the road behind him, illuminated briefly by his taillights before disappearing into darkness. Shaking with adrenaline, Ryan tried to convince himself that it was over, that whoever or whatever that man was couldn't possibly keep up with him now that he was driving at full speed. But then something even stranger happened. About 10 minutes later, as Ryan rounded a curve in the road, there he was again, the same figure standing on the shoulder of the highway ahead of him. "What? How is that possible?" Ryan whispered aloud as dread settled deep in his chest. This time, he didn't slow down or stop. He swerved slightly to avoid hitting the man and kept driving without looking back. Ryan drove for another 20 minutes without incident before finally pulling over at a scenic overlook to catch his breath. His hands were still shaking as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. He stepped out cautiously into the cold night air and looked around. No sign of anyone or anything unusual this time. The vast emptiness of Utah's desert stretched out before him under a canopy of stars. Just as relief began to wash over him, there came a sound from behind, a faint whisper carried by the wind. "You need help." Ryan spun around and saw him again, the same figure standing just a few feet away now. But this time something was different. The man's face was visible under moonlight. Pale skin stretched tightly over hollow cheekbones, eyes blacker than night itself, lips twisted into an unnatural grin. Before Ryan could react, all light seemed to vanish around him as an overwhelming sense of dread consumed him entirely. When Ryan woke up hours later at dawn, he found himself slumped over in his car seat with no memory of how he got there. His spare tire had been replaced perfectly, almost too perfectly, and there were no signs of anyone else having been there with him during those long hours on I-70. To this day, Ryan doesn't know who or what that figure was or what it wanted from him that night on Utah's loneliest highway, but one thing is certain. He'll never drive that stretch alone after dark again. And this is where the final story ends. If you liked all these true horror stories, then do subscribe to Horror Vault to keep enjoying these stories ahead. I will see you in the next video.